welcome to another episode of Critic Reading Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. This episode is an interregnum that will focus on showing how the principle of equivalence between the fantastic and the real in magical realism also turns specifically on the constitution of space and time, both in terms of the conflation or juxtaposition of different chronotopes and ontologies of space-time, and of the transposition or leakage of different spatio-temporal categories, one into another. What to a reader of realist literature might appear an odd event, such as the melting of the taciturn Armenian into a pestilential puddle right before Jose Arcadio Buendia's eyes as he desperately searches for Melquíades the gypsy in Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude, or Salim Sinai's uncanny capacity for turning his mind into a meeting place for the gathering of the Midnight Children in Salman Rushdie's novel, are only one aspect of what makes them magical realist texts. We shall see how the different chronotopes of space and time also entail different principles of indexicality and iconicity, such that the mixture of these principles can also help us discern the different emphases adopted in individual magical realist texts. If magical realism is that mode of writing that establishes a scrupulous equivalence between the codes of the fantastic and those of the real, then this equivalence is not only due to the integration of extraordinary characters and events into the purview of the ordinary and the mundane that we experience in everyday reality. Rather, as we noted in our introductory episode to this series, in magical realism, equivalence entails that the fantastic does not evoke surprise either from the narrator or from the characters within the story. That the fantastic is not a way of resolving a structural or other impasse within the narrative, and that there is no ethical distinction between the codes of realism and those of the fantastic. What is taken as the fantastic may derive from a variety of sources, none of which is rendered either subsidiary or superior to the real, classical or other mythology, religious symbolism, animism, features from folk tales and fairy tales, and space-time anamorphisms of various kinds. Equivalence in magical realism also turns specifically on the constitution of space and time, both in terms of the conflation or juxtaposition of different ontologies of space-time and of the transposition or leakage of different spatio-temporal categories into one another. The co-presence of different spatio-temporal ontologies are established differently in magical realist texts, such that the epistemological transpositions of space-time in Jorge Luis Borges's short story Clon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, and the Garden of Walking Paths, the oscillation between the equally magical domains of Christian antiquity and 20th century Moscow in Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, the uncanny transformation of a man into an insect, and the consequences for the domestic sphere in Franz Kafka's Metamorphoses, the animist realism of Amos Tutola's My Life, In the Bush of Ghosts, and The Palm Wine Drinkard, and the ontological yet deeply sensual elusiveness of the cities in Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, all provide different ways by which to conceptualize the constitution of space and time in magical realism. While Kafka, Borges, Tutola, and Calvino may not be conventionally described as magical realist writers, the fantastical spatio-temporal elements they introduce into their writings can readily be read as offering templates for the integration of different ontologies within magical realism proper. Thus, we would not be mistaken in taking them as providing the inspiration for different forms of the genre. Toward the end of his essay on forms of time and chronotope in the novel, Mikhail Bakhtin writes, "A literary work's artistic unity in relationship to an actual reality is defined by its chronotope. Therefore, the chronotope in a work always contains within it an evaluating aspect that can be isolated from the whole artistic chronotope only in abstract analysis. We cannot but be strongly impressed by the representational importance of the chronotope. Time becomes in effect palpable and visible. The chronotope makes narrative events concrete, makes them take on flesh, causes blood to flow in their events. An event can be communicated, it becomes information. One can give precise data on the place and time of its occurrence. It is precisely the chronotope that provides the grounds essential for the showing forth the representability of events." From the examples that Bakhtin provides throughout his essay, and especially in his concluding remarks, we get the sense that the chronotope is not only a resource for understanding clock time, but also a concept for grasping the contours of history as they are inextricably connected to space. The chronotope represents a confluence of time with space in such a way as to make time oscillate between history and temporality. Additionally, and equally importantly, the chronotope offers a venue for exploring social relations. And finally, the chronotope is an instrument of cognitive significance regarding both the literary artifact and its relationship to reality. What Bakhtin states about the possibility of precise data on the time and place of the occurrence of the event betrays his privileging of realist narrative, or at least on an interpretation of narrative that might yield information that is cognitively akin to the encounter with transparent space and time in everyday life. This realist orientation to the chronotope undergoes major revisions in the mode of magical realism, such that the mimetic relations between magical realism and the world beyond it must be understood as demarcating important shifts and reorientations. At the most elementary level, every magical realist text derives its organizational focus from one or two specific chronotopes. Thus, we have the Buendia household in Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude, 124 Bluestone Road in Toni Morrison's Beloved, various configurations of the road in Junot Díaz's Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and the chutney factory in Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, to name some of the most well-known instances. In these novels, the chronotope acts as the start and end point for weaving together various narrative threads. This is so even if the central chronotopes are joined by subsidiary chronotopes to form layers of spatio-temporal significations. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, 124 Bluestone Road is layered upon Sweet Home, the plantation on which Sethi and the Pauls were first brought up proudly by the Garners, then ruthlessly brutalized by school teacher and his nephews that come to take over the farm. The effect of the layering of the two spaces is to trigger a series of imagistic and affective interruptions into the present tense of unfolding events, but especially in the minds of Sethi and Paul G., the only survivors from Sweet Home Farm. In 100 Years of Solitude, the fact that all the narrative threads start from and terminate in the Buendia household in Macondo also means that the house is the staging post for many dramatic entrances and exits, thus linking the chronotope of the house to that of the road, which in the novel also splinters into different kinds of road chronotope to incorporate exploration, wandering, war, and even the pathway for the arrival of the apocalyptic plague of ants at the final climax of the text. Critical to the mimetic relations that obtain between magical realism and the world beyond the text are the relations that are established between indexicality, iconicity, and the putative real world. In literary writing, an indexical item may briefly be described as one that points in a more or less direct way to the recognizable world outside of the text. This mode of referencing is never entirely unmediated by textuality, and yet it invites us to see elements of the text in question as somehow bearing a direct mimetic relationship to history, society, and culture that lie in the real world beyond. Much as how a newspaper or historical document might imply such a relationship. Iconicity, on the other hand, pertains to the relation between textual elements and context or conditions interpreted as more symbolic and allegorical than historical or real. Iconicity transcends mimesis to postulate a larger universal value that derives from the truth of the image rather than that of referentiality. Thus, within the genre of the historical novel, we might assert somewhat formulaically that the indexical is the dominant mode, while in fantasy literature, or science fiction, or horror fiction, or magical realism, it is the iconic that predominates. Even though fantasy, science fiction, and horror do not operate in the same way as magical realism, they provide cognate methods for reordering the relationship between the real and the fantastical, even if rarely to establish the degree of equivalence that defines magical realism. However, it is never the case that any given text is entirely indexical or iconic, but rather that there is often an elision or tension between the two that helps to define the textual energies of the text in question. These are issues that are at the core of the conceptual genealogy of magical realism. And the contrast between indexicality and iconicity ultimately has implications for how we view the representational ethics implied by space-time configurations within the magical realist text. Does the dystopian violence or the fantastical sexual machines in Angela Carter's The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman tell us something about the relationship between procreation and Hobbesian nature? And does the installation of Clara's fantastical perspective in Isabel Allende's House of Spirits serve as an adequate political critique of the violent unfolding of Latin American history, or merely a marginal way of looking awry at history and thus coping with it? Even though, for heuristic purposes, we may separate space and time as distinctive categories for analysis, their implications can never be fully worked out individually, but only in the manner by which they are integrated into the entire magical realist textual apparatus of which they are a part. Space and time within the magical realist text do not merely raise questions of geography, history, or temporality, but are rather the interstices of the multiply signifying dimensions of characterization, foreground and background, as well as of the distribution of ethical dispositions within the novel. As we shall see in various upcoming episodes, the significance of different modalities and configurations of space and time for grasping the relationship between indexicality, iconicity, and a putative real world allow us to gain a sense of the richness of the genre and make us see the world anew in each instance. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give it a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.